The Nile, lifeblood of northeastern Africa, has shaped civilizations for thousands of years. Its waters have nourished crops, supported bustling cities, and inspired legends from ancient times to the present day. Stretching over 4,100 miles, the river is not just a geographical feature, it is a vital artery that connects millions of lives across borders and generations. Now the Nile has entered a new and contentious chapter, one that could redefine the future of the entire region. In July 2025, Egypt's government announced sweeping and unprecedented restrictions on its stretch of the river. The news sent shockwaves through the region as the country rolled out stringent licensing requirements for water use, ramped up surveillance along the riverbanks, and established new military zones to monitor and control access. These measures have tightened Cairo's grip on the flow that sustains 115 million Egyptians, raising concerns about water security and daily life for millions who depend on the river for drinking, farming, and industry. Upstream nations, especially Ethiopia and Sudan, view Egypt's actions as a provocative escalation in an already tense landscape. For them, the Nile is equally essential, and any restriction downstream threatens their own development and sovereignty. For centuries, the Nile has symbolized life, power, and unity. Its banks have witnessed the rise and fall of empires, and its waters have been a source of both cooperation and conflict. Today, however, Egypt frames the Nile as a finite resource, one that must be guarded fiercely in the face of growing populations, climate change, and regional competition. The timing of these restrictions, just before crucial tripartite talks between Egypt, Ethiopia, and Sudan, is widely seen as a hardline negotiating tactic, intended to strengthen Egypt's position at the bargaining table. This escalation transforms a simmering dispute into a palpable crisis, rooted in colonial-era treaties, historical grievances, and fiercely held national identities. The legacy of past agreements continues to shape the present, fueling mistrust and uncertainty. The world now watches with bated breath. Will these new restrictions push the region toward long-overdue cooperation and shared management of the Nile's waters, or dangerously closer to open conflict and instability? The stakes have never been higher, and the next moves will shape the destiny of millions. To understand today's crisis, we must look back at the hydropolitics that shaped the Nile Basin. Egypt's control of the Nile is foundational, enshrined in colonial-era treaties that granted it near-total dominance. The 1929 and 1959 agreements allocated the vast majority of the river's flow to Egypt and Sudan, sidelining upstream nations like Ethiopia. For Egypt, these treaties are non-negotiable. For others, they're relics of a colonial past. The core fault line: Egypt's insistence on historic rights versus upstream demands for equitable use. Egypt's latest restrictions are a modern assertion of this old dominance, deepening the region's divisions. The Aswan High Dam stands as Egypt's ultimate symbol of mastery over the Nile. Towering above the river's ancient banks, it represents a bold attempt to harness and control a force that has shaped Egyptian civilization for millennia. The dam is not just a feat of engineering, it is a testament to human ambition, determination, and the desire to bend nature to our will. Completed in 1970 after years of intense labor and international collaboration, the dam created the vast expanse of Lake Nasser, one of the world's largest artificial lakes. This reservoir made possible year-round irrigation, transforming Egypt's agriculture by allowing multiple crop cycles and reducing the country's dependence on unpredictable seasonal floods. The dam also generates vital hydroelectric power, lighting up cities, and fueling industries across the nation, and providing a sense of security and progress for millions of Egyptians. Yet this control comes at a cost. The dam's immense storage capacity acts as Egypt's buffer against devastating droughts, but it also traps the nutrient-rich silt that once fertilized the Nile Delta. Over time, this has led to declining soil fertility, forcing farmers to rely on chemical fertilizers, and has contributed to the erosion of Egypt's Mediterranean coastline, threatening communities and livelihoods. Lake Nasser's vast surface area, stretching deep into the desert, leads to massive water loss through evaporation, an estimated 10 to 16 billion cubic meters each year. This staggering loss is greater than the total annual water allocations of some upstream Nile Basin countries, making every drop even more precious in a region where water is life. The Aswan High Dam is both Egypt's greatest strength and its most significant vulnerability. Any major upstream project, especially Ethiopia's Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, poses a direct challenge to Egypt's water security. The delicate balance of the Nile's flow is now at the center of regional tensions, with the future of millions hanging in the balance. In response, Egypt has imposed new water restrictions and stepped up monitoring of the Nile, taking defensive measures to protect this vital artery. These actions reflect the growing anxiety over the dam's ability to safeguard the nation's future in the face of mounting external pressures. The Aswan High Dam is not just a piece of infrastructure, it is the beating heart of Egypt's water security, the foundation of its agricultural and economic stability, and, paradoxically, its Achilles heel. Its fate is inseparable from that of the nation itself. The stakes for Egypt could not be higher. The future of the country, its people, and its civilization depends on the delicate balance maintained by this monumental structure, a balance now more precarious than ever. Egypt's new Nile restrictions are driven by water scarcity, population growth, and security fears. With per capita water supply far below the UN's poverty threshold, Egypt's survival depends on the Nile's uninterrupted flow. The government argues that tighter control and licensing will maximize efficiency and support food security. Egypt's agricultural sector, employing a quarter of the workforce, is entirely dependent on Nile irrigation. The rise of Ethiopia and the GERD challenges Egypt's long-standing hydrohegemony. These restrictions are both a message to rivals and a claim of responsible stewardship. Cairo frames its actions as conservation, but neighbors see a provocative power play. Egypt seeks to legitimize its moves internationally, even as regional tensions rise. At the heart of a growing crisis in Northeast Africa stands Ethiopia's Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, or GERD. This massive hydroelectric project, built on the Blue Nile, is the largest of its kind on the continent, and has become a focal point of both hope and anxiety for millions of people. For Ethiopia, the GERD is much more than just a dam. It represents a bold leap toward national progress, a symbol of unity and ambition. The government promises that the dam will double the country's electricity generation, bringing power to rural villages and fueling industry. For millions of Ethiopians, GERD is a beacon of hope, offering the chance to lift entire communities out of poverty and into a brighter, more prosperous future. But for Egypt, the story is very different. The Nile is Egypt's lifeblood, providing over 90% of its fresh water. Egyptian officials and citizens alike see the dam as an existential threat. They fear that if Ethiopia fills the reservoir too quickly, it could drastically reduce the flow of water downstream, crippling Egypt's agriculture, threatening drinking water supplies, and even disrupting power generation at the Aswan High Dam. Cairo has repeatedly demanded a legally binding agreement on how and when water will be released from the dam, seeking guarantees to protect its vital interests. Ethiopia, on the other hand, insists on its sovereign right to manage the dam as it sees fit, arguing that it has the right to use its own natural resources for development. The GERD fundamentally shifts the balance of power along the Nile. For the first time, Ethiopia holds the ability to actively manage the river's flow, a role that has historically belonged to Egypt. This new reality has introduced uncertainty and tension into a region already marked by fragile politics. Negotiations have repeatedly stalled, with each side viewing the other's demands as a direct threat to their survival. Trust is in short supply, and every round of talks seems to end in deeper suspicion and frustration. Ethiopia's decision to begin filling the reservoir unilaterally has only heightened Egypt's anxiety. Each stage of filling is met with diplomatic protests and public outcry in Cairo, as Egyptians worry about the future of their water security. In response, Egypt has imposed new restrictions and stepped up efforts to conserve water, hoping to maximize control over its remaining supply. These measures are a sign of just how seriously Egypt views the threat posed by the GERD. The standoff over the GERD is now more than a technical dispute. It has become a test of national resolve, pride, and survival for both Ethiopia and Egypt. The outcome will shape the future of the Nile and the fate of millions who depend on its waters. Upstream nations have swiftly condemned Egypt's new restrictions, seeing them as intimidation and a bid to enforce outdated claims. Ethiopia and others, united under the Cooperative Framework Agreement, argue for equitable sharing and reject Egypt's dominance. The African Union's mediation efforts have struggled, as Egypt's move complicates negotiations and signals distrust in diplomacy. Regional analysts warn that Egypt's strategy may backfire, galvanizing upstream countries to accelerate their own water projects. Instead of submission, the restrictions could trigger a rally around the flag effect, making compromise harder. The risk, a cycle of escalating actions that destabilizes the entire Nile basin. Egypt's isolation within Africa could deepen as upstream nations push back. The region stands at a crossroads: cooperation or confrontation. Sudan is caught between Ethiopia's ambitions and Egypt's anxieties, both geographically and politically. The GERD offers Sudan benefits: reduced flooding, reliable irrigation, and cheap electricity, but also risks to its own dams. Sudan demands a binding operational agreement with Ethiopia, sharing some of Egypt's concerns. Political instability in Sudan complicates its stance, with internal factions divided over alignment. Egypt's new restrictions pressure Sudan to side with Cairo, but Khartoum treads carefully, calling for de-escalation. Sudan seeks to avoid direct confrontation, maintaining ties with both neighbors. As tensions mount, Sudan's balancing act grows more precarious. Its choices may determine whether the region moves toward conflict or cooperation. The international community has tried to mediate the Nile dispute, but with little success. The UN Security Council and African Union have urged negotiation, but lack leverage to enforce a solution. US and EU-led talks produced draft agreements, but deep legal and political divides remain. Egypt and Sudan cite colonial-era treaties, Ethiopia and others demand equitable use. Without a shared legal framework, technical negotiations stall. Egypt's new restrictions signal frustration with diplomacy and a turn to unilateral action. This could either force renewed talks or push parties further apart. The fate of the Nile now rests with the leaders of Egypt, Ethiopia, and Sudan. Egypt's new Nile restrictions mark a dangerous escalation in a long-running regional dispute. The crisis pits Egypt's historic rights and water fears against Ethiopia's development ambitions. Sudan is caught in the middle, while international mediation falters. The core disagreement, historic rights versus equitable use, remains unresolved. As demands on the Nile outstrip its capacity, the risk of conflict grows. The region faces a stark choice: renewed cooperation or a slide toward confrontation. The next moves by Cairo, Addis Ababa, and Khartoum will shape the Nile's future and the fate of millions.